The war in Afghanistan did not end with a treaty, a parade, or a clear victory. It ended at a crowded strip of concrete, surrounded by panic, desperation, and armed men watching from the shadows. Kabul Airport became the final battlefield of a 20-year conflict almost overnight. When the Afghan government collapsed, the security architecture holding Kabul together disintegrated in hours, not days. Police units vanished, checkpoints were abandoned, and armed groups moved freely through the capital. In that vacuum, Hamid Karzai International Airport transformed from a transit hub into the last defensible ground controlled by coalition forces. No military doctrine was written for this situation. Tens of thousands of civilians surged toward the airport with no evacuation order, no screening process, and no perimeter depth. Soldiers trained for combat suddenly found themselves holding the line between survival and chaos. The terrain itself worked against the defenders. Narrow access roads funneled crowds into choke points, while urban structures provided concealment for hostile observers. Every wall, rooftop, and alley beyond the wire became a potential threat vector. Traditional base defense assumes layered security, early warning, and controlled access. Kabul Airport had none of these advantages during the first critical days. The perimeter was compressed, undermanned, and exposed on all sides. Inside the wire, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Aircraft engines roared day and night as evacuations continued without pause, shaking nerves and limiting communication. Heat, exhaustion, and sleep deprivation compounded operational stress. Outside the gates, the humanitarian crisis escalated by the hour. Families pressed forward carrying children, documents, and hope, while armed fighters observed and negotiated positions of control. The defenders were forced to operate under constant moral and tactical pressure simultaneously. Rules of engagement became as important as weapons discipline. One misjudged shot could trigger a mass casualty event or ignite a firefight in the middle of civilians. Restraint became a combat skill as critical as marksmanship. Coordination between coalition units was improvised in real time. Marines, airborne troops, special operations elements, and allied forces shared overlapping sectors with limited situational awareness. Every decision had to balance speed, safety, and strategic consequence. The airport was never designed to be a fortress. Its fencing, gates, and open approaches offered little protection against determined adversaries. Yet it was all that stood between evacuation and catastrophe. Taliban fighters positioned themselves just beyond coalition reach, testing reactions without provoking escalation. Their presence added psychological pressure without triggering direct confrontation. The defenders understood that deterrence, not dominance, was the mission. This was not a battle planned in briefing rooms or rehearsed on training grounds. It was an emergency defense born of collapse, improvisation, and endurance. Kabul Airport became the last stand not by choice, but by necessity. By the time evacuation operations stabilized, defenders at Kabul Airport were already outnumbered by forces they could not openly engage. Taliban fighters controlled the surrounding districts, blending into crowds and occupying key approaches. Numerical superiority belonged entirely to those outside the wire. The defenders' mission was not to defeat the enemy, but to prevent collapse. Every position had to project strength without provoking a firefight. Deterrence replaced dominance as the guiding tactical principle. Taliban elements tested the perimeter through pressure rather than assault. Fighters advanced civilians toward gates to compress security space and observe reactions. Each movement was a probe, measuring discipline and restraint. Coalition troops held static positions for hours without relief. Ammunition was carried but rarely chambered. Weapons kept low but ready. The message was deliberate control, not fear. Rules of engagement were enforced with absolute precision. The presence of civilians meant that escalation thresholds were dangerously narrow. One miscalculation could have turned a standoff into a massacre. Defensive posture relied on posture, spacing, and presence rather than firepower. Small teams covered wide sectors with overlapping observation. Body language, positioning, and eye contact became tools of control. Communication across the line was constant and concise. Hand signals replaced radios in the noise and confusion of aircraft and crowds. Every soldier understood that clarity prevented panic. Taliban fighters exploited the knowledge that coalition forces were constrained. They maneuvered close enough to intimidate, but far enough to avoid engagement. It was psychological warfare executed in plain sight. Despite exhaustion, defenders maintained discipline under relentless pressure. Many had been awake for days, operating on adrenaline and duty. Fatigue was managed quietly because failure was not an option. Crowd density magnified every risk. A single surge could crush civilians against barriers or overwhelm a position. The defenders adjusted spacing repeatedly to absorb pressure without breaking formation. What held the line was not overwhelming force, but professional restraint. Against superior numbers and constant provocation, the perimeter did not collapse. In that discipline, the defenders denied the enemy a victory without firing a shot. The true story of Kabul Airport lies not in maps or strategy charts, but in the soldiers who endured the chaos hour by hour. Inside the wire, exhaustion was constant, and danger was omnipresent. Every face told a story of fatigue, fear, and unwavering resolve. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. Troops rotated in shifts that blurred into one continuous watch, eyes scanning the perimeter for threats that could appear at any second. Meals were skipped, and water was rationed, yet focus never wavered. The defenders faced moral dilemmas alongside tactical ones. Children clung to gates, families pressed forward, and every decision carried life or death consequences. Choosing who entered first was a judgment no soldier was fully prepared to make. Amid the chaos, brotherhood became the unspoken backbone of survival. Soldiers relied on silent communication, instinctive trust, and shared history to maintain cohesion. Each man's attention to the other's safety was as important as controlling the gates. Weapons were not just tools. They were symbols of restraint and responsibility. Soldiers carried lethal force, yet exercised restraint under scrutiny and threat. The discipline required was as taxing mentally as any physical maneuver. Every loud engine, shouted command, or surge in the crowd tested nerves. Airplanes roared overhead, helicopters buzzed across the tarmac, and explosions rang in the distance. Yet inside the perimeter, calm determination was enforced like a command. Psychological stress was relentless. Fear of failure, loss, or unintended civilian harm weighed heavily on every decision. Soldiers confronted their own limits while continuing to protect thousands who could not protect themselves. Small victories mattered in measurable increments. Controlling a choke point, calming a crowd surge, or diverting a potential threat became critical milestones. Each success reinforced confidence and maintained order under impossible circumstances. The men who held the line understood the stakes. Their actions, measured and disciplined, kept evacuation operations alive. Without them, the last flights out of Kabul would have been far costlier and chaos far deadlier. The chaos at Kabul Airport demanded split-second decisions with consequences that could ripple far beyond the perimeter. Commanders faced conflicting intelligence, collapsing allies, and the constant presence of civilians in harm's way. Every order had to balance evacuation efficiency with the preservation of life. Communication lines were fragmented, yet coordination was essential. Marines, airborne units, and special operations elements all operated within overlapping sectors. Each unit relied on rapid updates and improvisation to maintain situational awareness. Commanders had to weigh risk versus reward constantly. Ordering defensive fire could protect the perimeter, but risk civilian casualties. Conversely, restraint might maintain peace but invite enemy encroachment. Every decision was compounded by collapsing infrastructure. Checkpoints were gone, local security forces had vanished, and road access was limited. Commanders had to improvise barriers, redirect crowds, and manage entry points with whatever resources were at hand. The airport perimeter itself became a test of leadership under pressure. Commanders had to enforce discipline, coordinate shifts, and maintain morale amidst exhaustion. One misjudgment could cascade into panic, disorder, or a catastrophic breach. Allied forces operated under differing protocols and doctrines. Coalition cohesion relied on mutual respect, shared objectives, and clear communication despite cultural and operational differences. Synchronizing actions required constant oversight and decisive leadership. Evacuation priorities were constantly reassessed. Vulnerable populations, allied personnel, and operational equipment competed for space on the aircraft. Decisions about who boarded first required not just strategy, but empathy and foresight. Commanders also had to enemy's intent. Taliban fighters observed patterns, tested responses, and exploited gaps. Predicting behavior under pressure became as important as maintaining the perimeter itself. Leadership under these conditions demanded both courage and humility. Commanders could not control every variable, yet they had to inspire confidence and decisiveness. Their choices shaped the outcome of an operation that would determine the fate of thousands. In the end, effective command at Kabul Airport relied on adaptation. Leaders balanced risk, maintained discipline, and kept operations moving under unprecedented conditions. Their decisions ensured that, despite chaos, the line held and the evacuation continued. The threat outside Kabul Airport was constant, but direct confrontation was not inevitable. Taliban fighters hovered near the perimeter, probing defenses, testing responses, and measuring discipline. Their presence created a psychological battlefield as intense as any firefight. Taliban tactics relied on intimidation rather than full assault. They funneled civilians toward gates, observed reactions, and sought openings to exploit. Each approach tested the defenders' composure without triggering direct engagement. Coalition troops had to exercise extraordinary restraint. One misjudged shot could spark a massacre or ignite chaos among thousands of civilians. Discipline became the critical tool that preserved order under extreme stress. The fine line between deterrence and provocation dominated every decision. Maintaining a visible professional defense signaled strength while avoiding escalation. Any deviation risked turning controlled standoffs into deadly confrontations. Civilians in the surge complicated every calculation. Families, children, and unarmed men and women pressed against barriers, forcing troops to calibrate response with precision. Human presence became a shield and a constraint simultaneously. Close encounters were frequent, tension measurable in heartbeats. Taliban fighters navigated the edges of engagement, testing the threshold of coalition patience. Every interaction demanded judgment, discipline, and situational awareness. Rules of engagement were both weapon and shield. They defined limits, guided behavior, and reduced the risk of catastrophe. Adherence to these rules prevented the perimeter from devolving into uncontrolled violence. Even with restraint, danger never fully receded. Snipers, armed infiltrators, and sudden surges remained threats. Soldiers stayed alert, aware that a single mistake could undo hours of disciplined effort. Ultimately, the stand at Kabul Airport was a test of control under pressure. The line held not because of superior numbers or firepower, but because restraint was enforced with unwavering consistency. In this balance, chaos was contained and lives were saved. The Taliban waited, calculated, and threatened, but never crossed the threshold of catastrophe. The defenders' measured response became a force multiplier. Their discipline ensured that heroism was expressed not only in combat, but in restraint. The final hours at Kabul Airport were a convergence of exhaustion, urgency, and history. Aircraft roared down runways, carrying the last evacuees from a collapsing city. Each takeoff marked a fleeting victory against chaos and inevitability. Inside the perimeter, soldiers moved with precision despite fatigue. Shifts were seamless, sectors monitored, and gates controlled with disciplined efficiency. Every action was a deliberate step toward completing a mission that carried the weight of 2 decades. The airport had become a microcosm of the war itself, Desperation, courage, and uncertainty filled every corner. Soldiers, civilians, and allies coexisted under extreme pressure, bound together by circumstance rather than planning. The last planes carried not only people, but the symbolic end of a conflict. Each flight represented closure, escape, and survival. As the sun set on the final day, the airport was both a lifeline and a reminder of loss. Every decision remained critical until the very end. Boarding priorities, crowd control, and perimeter management demanded constant attention. No moment allowed for complacency, as the consequences of failure were immediate and visible. Defenders witnessed acts of heroism that went unseen by the world. Soldiers lifted children over gates, cleared pathways for the vulnerable, and maintained calm under overwhelming pressure. Their courage was measured in small victories, repeated relentlessly. The Taliban loitered beyond observation points, waiting, testing, but never breaking the threshold. Their restraint, combined with coalition discipline, prevented disaster. The outcome of the evacuation was determined as much by controlled decision-making as by military might. As the final aircraft departed, silence fell over the perimeter. Exhausted soldiers surveyed the tarmac, knowing their actions had allowed thousands to escape. The chaos that defined Kabul for weeks had been transformed into an ordered exodus by sheer discipline and resolve. Kabul Airport would remain a symbol of courage under impossible conditions. The defenders' endurance, restraint, and professionalism became the defining acts of the final hours. In those moments, the war ended not with a triumph, but with a disciplined and heroic last stand. The 20-year conflict concluded on that concrete strip, where thousands survived because a handful of soldiers held firm. Their last stand ensured that history would remember not only the fall of a city, but the unwavering resolve of those who refused to let it collapse completely.